Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. So if you watched the last episode, I completed the 6K service, which is pretty much a full inspection and an oil change. Well, maybe you're at the higher mileage interval at 12,000 miles or 20,000 kilometers. Now your BV400 is due for a drive belt, a new air filter, a spark plug, and valve adjustment. I'm going to divide this video up into two parts. So part one, we're going to go ahead and change the drive belt, the roller weights, and do the air filter, clean the filter under here, and also change the final drive hub oil. So first of all, I got to show you the parts that you need to be set up for success. So you can find all these parts on our web store, ScooterWest.com. So of course, if you're changing the drive belt, you need a drive belt. It's a different part number than the BV350. 1A016410 is the drive belt. The air filter is a non-cleanable. It's a replaceable element, paper element. They're very effective in good air filters. Sometimes you can clean them, tap them out, and blow them out. But I'm going to service this scooter exactly as per what the Piaggio recommendation is. The Scooter West part number for the air filter is 1A023584. And in addition to the drive belt, you're going to need some other parts as well. So you're going to need the guide shoes for the Variator. I highly recommend replacing those. You need 4 of them, B014584. You're going to need the roller weights. At ScooterWest.com, we sell them as a set of 8 for the OEM roller weights. The specific weights for the BV400 are 1A019456, and they're sold as an 8-pack at ScooterWest.com. The change of hub oil is pretty recommended that you replace both the fill and the drain washers. Part number on these is crush washer-M10. And then you're going to need a bottle of 80W90 Gear Oil. You're going to only need about 500 cc's of that oil, so a bottle is going to get you 2 changes. So let's get right to it. I'll show you the tools that are needed. If you're wondering what the skill set for this, it's definitely a little bit more than doing an oil change, but not as involved as doing the valve adjustment or tearing into the motor a little bit. I'm just going to zip through things on this video, make it nice and quick. I assume you're an intermediate mechanic or a professional mechanic and just want to scrub through this. So unlike my normal videos where I use all hand tools for the do-it-yourself videos, I'm going to use some power tools. So the air filter box is held by Phillips screwdrivers. They're very coarse thread screws. So all the way around the perimeter of the air box. If you're wondering what this whole thing is, it can drain moisture out of the air box. You can give it a little squeeze. But since we'll have the air box apart, we'll be able to clean any blow-by vapor out of there. Also pretty important that you look to see that the 2 fasteners that hold the air box are still in place. Sometimes I actually have a wrench handy and just tighten those. And I like getting the air filter out of the way. Just makes for a little bit better clearance when you're doing the thing. So as you can see, there's some blow-by oil in there. Go ahead and let that drain out and clean it. Set those screws aside. This is your disposable element. See, it's not horribly dirty, but we're going to go ahead and replace that. There's one other thing you want to check is this gasket in here. Over time, when your airbox starts getting dirty from the outside, you may want to replace that gasket. So go ahead and take some disposable rags. Just go ahead and wipe the inside of the airbox so it's not dripping any further. Kind of shines up the plastic, that oil. And maybe you want to take some rags, you can shove it in there. Obviously, you don't want to ever start the motor with something like that in there. You have the 2 fasteners right there you want to check. Now we're going to get the belt cover out of the way. The actual outer plastic belt cover is 2 belt covers, essentially. A T30 Torx driver. And all these fasteners are pretty much the same. Sometimes the belt cover will hang up on this little wire that's in the front. So go ahead and set that aside. There's one thing in here that you're going to find as well. there's a little screen in here. We'll blow that out or clean out with a brake parts cleaner, and that's your belt filter right there. It's just a metal screen. Go ahead and pry this little cover off. Set that aside. So two ways you can remove this, with an electric or air impact, or you can put the factory tool that holds the driven pulley, and the part number on this is 02917V. For a do-it-yourselfer, I don't really recommend buying a tool like this. You could turn the pegs around in here and kind of move those around so you could get those to line up. Actually, sometimes you can just crank the whole thing, and then you jam this tool in here and it jams up that nut. Alternatively, if you're very careful, you could do, maybe want to have more than one hand, you could use 2 screwdrivers and carefully do that. But I would just recommend zipping that nut off with electric impact wrench. All right, so 15mm socket, of course a nice electric impact. You can find these pretty affordable now. There's like nice Makita or even Ryobi ones will do the trick. It's got either 3/8 or a 1/2 inch drive. The electric ones are so nice. And that's probably gonna be your easiest way to remove that. Next, we're gonna go ahead and remove the rest of the fasteners around the belt cover with an 8mm socket. I have one on my electric driver right here. Keep in mind, sometimes they don't have screws in all the holes. I think that one's just genuinely missing. It should have a screw right there. And sometimes those are a little hard to get, and if you wanted to, you can remove the 2 fasteners that hold the airbox. See, that one's a little bit loose, but you don't necessarily need to remove the airbox. This has a magnet in there, so it makes the job ever so easier. Go and remove this one. There's also this little bracket in the way. And go ahead and separate this little bracket right here. I actually kind of did that not in the best order. So this little bracket holds the airbox, and we're just gonna set that aside as a different fastener. So that kind of goes in front. And we got all the fasteners out. So they're all the same size bolts right there. Set them all aside. And sometimes you can just pull this off. Sometimes you'll need to give it a little persuasion. You could tap on these points right here with a punch. Or if you're really trick, you could find a mechanic slide hammer, and this hooks on those little tabs. So, and that's what works a little more effective than tapping from the backside. And robot made a mistake. There's one more bolt. Now I can just tell by the noise it was making. So if it's not coming with a couple little persuasion taps, then you know there's probably one more bolt holding it. But my experience is, as these scooters age and if they're used in the weather, you get some rust on the dowels and they just get a little more difficult to remove. So go ahead and pull that belt cover right off. While you're at it, check this bearing. Should be very smooth. It feels perfectly smooth, nice and quiet as I spin it. So not really an issue there. I can tell you one thing I do notice is there's probably more oil than there should be in here. So we're gonna check the seal behind the actual clutch cover. So there shouldn't really be that much oil in there. So now that we have access to the dry belt, put a 21mm socket on here. You could use a large pin spanner to lock the pulley. And typically I like to pull the belt down just a little bit so it's wobbling around in there. And of course, an electric impact is gonna make this job much easier. You see all that dust in there, that's nothing to be alarmed about. Just kind of dust from the belt as it breaks down. You have this thick washer that you want to keep it oriented, the outside. Obviously the rust is kind of a telltale of the outside. So kind of just be aware of how it came off, because we'll put it back on in the same way. And then I'm rocking the pulley right off. And the nice thing is they actually put the torque on there, 120 to 130 Newton meters. This center one is I think about 74 to 80 Newton meters. And these pulleys look nice. We put a flat edge here. There's not really any grooves, like it's heavily worn. If this pulley had about 48,000 miles, it's probably due for replacement. That's just a typical, after you go through a couple belts, they typically need to be replaced. Same with the variator. If there's any grooves in there, I just replace the whole variator. Nice thing about a new variator is it includes the roller weights and those guides. You're gonna have a little thicker washer, so pull that off and set that in your little stack. And then you carefully pull the belt and the driven pulley off. So sometimes the slide hammer comes in handy. So, you know, that thing was a little bit stuck. And the idea of a slide hammer is like a reverse hammer. It's actually pulling things off. And they're pretty handy tools to have, especially if you're doing mechanics work quite frequently. So this is splined onto that shaft. And you may need to rock it quite a bit. You can get the belt out of here at this point. And we'll look at the belt. 12,000 miles is the service life. My experience, if you're gonna ride this scooter really hard, like always go top speed on the highway, this belt may not make it to 12,000 miles. If you're really easy on the scooter and just ride around the city and decent speeds on the highway, like 65, 70 miles an hour, no more than 110 kilometers an hour, these belts probably could go past the service interval. And it also depends on the temperature, the weather, in addition to how you ride it. So pull this off. Looks like we got an oil leak right here. I can see the wet oil coming right down here. So we're going to change that seal. So it looks like it's been leaking for a little bit. I can see all this residue. There's also a possibility that the O-ring around this large cover might be leaking. I haven't really seen that issue, but I have seen these oil seals leak in the past here. All right, so the last thing I'm gonna pull out is the variator. And I like to get my fingers behind the variator when I pull it out, because if you pull the actual variator sheath off, it's gonna wanna just dump the pulley. So I'm pulling it from the backside, and you'll see where my fingers are when I get this off. I'm actually holding it from back here. This boss wants to drop right out, just like that. We're gonna clean all these parts. This pulls out, and those little guides get replaced. Same with all the rollers. They do have some small flat spots on them. You probably could get away with reusing them, but if you want the best performance in miles per gallon and efficiency, I just recommend changing them out. So you can see they have an open side and a closed side. So the open side always faces clockwise. That's pretty standard for these non-symmetrical rollers. So get all these out of the way, dispose of the old rollers. We're gonna have to clean all these parts. I'm gonna go ahead and replace that seal. And at that point, once we clean all these parts, we'll be able to start assembling the variator and transmission and belt drive. So a quick little intermission in doing our belt and 12,000 mile service. So we're gonna go ahead and replace the seal. Part number is 825238. That's the Scooter West part number. The latest part number is 873931. That's what we sell here. And it's a brand new seal. It's possible to get that seal out without removing that cover. Of course, if you remove the cover, we're gonna need to replace that O-ring, and it's also drain the gearbox oil, which we'll get to a little bit later. There is specific tools, like different types of picks that you can get behind the seal and give it a little pry. The idea is you do not want to scratch the shaft when you get it, extract a seal. So usually you get the seal pick right behind the seal and it just pops it right out. Obviously it's gonna ruin that seal, but that seal's leaking anyways, so pops right out. Not that difficult to do. Take a very clean rag and just go in there and clean everything up. Make sure everything's perfectly clean. You may want to clean it with another rag, maybe spray it with some brake parts cleaner. Probably don't want to dilute the oil that's in that shaft. Don't be alarmed, there is some free play in there because this shaft is actually supported by another bearing. Go put the new seal in. Don't really want to put it in dry, so the seal comes dry. You want to take something like this Maxima grease, Make sure everything's clean. And on the outer ribs of the seal, put some grease, and then on those inner lips of the seal. And also, sometimes it's not a bad idea just to put a little bit on the other side as well, kind of the shaft, because there's a pretty sharp edge right there, and that's sometimes what tears the seals. And you kind of just push the seal, and sometimes you just push them right in. So oftentimes you can just do that. Take a clean rag, we'll wipe all the excess grease off. And you see the seal's not flush with this aluminum here. Just want to take a little machinist hammer and just give it a couple little taps and kind of work your way around it. Do it slow. You don't want to have it get too cockeyed when you're tapping a seal in. And I can see it's nice and flush all the way around. And there's a nice successful seal replacement there. Not alarming to see a seal like that leak. BV350s have done that, even GTSs. The shaft spins at a tremendously high speed, but go ahead and replace that seal. Pretty inexpensive part. One thing to keep in mind, if the bike's new enough and it's under warranty, that would be covered under warranty. If your variator wears out, the pulleys wear out, the clutch wears out, or your drive belt wears out or breaks, that would not be covered under warranty, because Piaggio considers all those items to be wear items. So just keep that in mind. So here's the driven pulley assembly for the BV400. You have the spring that's under quite a bit of pressure, so you do not want to zip that nut off without having the special tools to hold this all down. A reason you may want to rebuild this part, I've covered rebuilding the driven pulley assemblies on like a Vespa GTS. They're all pretty similar. Say for instance it breaks a belt prematurely, or your belt's squealing and slipping. Underneath here are, this sleeve pulls up when you have the spring out of here, and there's pins that you can re-grease. Maybe after you do a couple belts, like at 36,000 miles, it might be a good time to tear this all apart and clean it. I'm not going to cover that on this video, but it is something you want to keep in mind. You sometimes can service it. If the pins are mechanically worn, or they wore through, or this pulley's all loose, you just replace the whole thing. You can't actually separate these pulleys like in some of the other models. They're not available as separate parts. This side, make sure you don't get any grease. You can sometimes give it a little scuff on the edge with emery cloth sandpaper, like 80 grit. Doesn't need much. I find these belts grab pretty tight. But ideally you want to clean all these parts. They do have a lot of brake cleaner on them. And all you need is like a spray cleaner like this. Brake parts cleaner works perfect for this. And you can use a rag to dab it off, or just let it air dry. Use compressed air to blow it all off. And pretty much do the same for all the other parts. So yeah, this thing, you don't really need to do any service to it. Check, make sure the splines are all in place. Clean any of that brake cleaner that's building up on there, with the brake powder or belt powder, whatever you want to call it, residue. This boss, usually you want to clean that as well. Usually I like to put it in a rag. Just wipe it down with some brake cleaner. Just like that. And the part that's usually the most dirty is going to be your variator. So before you even clean it, I'm going to give it a little swirl, break the glaze on the pulley. You don't even need to get too much of that broken free, but just like that. And we'll do the same with that fixed pulley. And at that point we can clean. Clean the inner boss, clean that all off. Take a clean rag and just wipe that stuff. Make sure this is perfectly clean. This boss goes back in like such. Make sure it doesn't have excess free play. If there's a lot of wobble in this, I would just replace the whole entire variator assembly. So we'll set that aside. And then the fixed dry pulley. Again, for maximum performance, maybe at 36 or 48,000 miles, just want to replace these parts. Because they do get grooves, and oftentimes when you have grooves in the pulleys, you'll end up with, you'll lose some performance, your belt might break prematurely, so there's a lot of side effects to having worn out pulleys. All right, so we have the boss dropped in place, and we'll take our 8 variator weights. So there's the open side, open faces clockwise, and there's also marked with that blue. And just go and drop those into the wells all the way around. They're all identical rollers. Just make sure you get the orientation right. So open clockwise, and the last one right there. Press these variator guides on. You can see they have a triangle and then the round, so the round kind of faces on the inside. Just like such, all the way around. Doesn't really matter where this lines up. Again, look at those pegs. Sometimes those have some wear, and it should just be nice and smooth and drop right on. So at this point, I'm holding the variator just like that, kind of like giving it the pinch, and carefully slide it onto the crankshaft. Sometimes that want to go out and make sure it's all the way seated. So take your new belt. There is an arrow, the direction, so the motor turns this way. You turn the axle shaft, so the arrow faces towards the front if it's on the top. So we'll go ahead and take this pulley like that, and you see the belt's not in there. So put it on the ground. You want to have some clean gloves, and you're going to want to steer this thing. And sometimes you just want to get your knee in here, and it pulls up just like that, just a little bit, and you'll be able to get the belt in there. You want to get it where it's almost all the way in, and it's going to take a lot of force. These larger CC motors, they take quite a bit of force to get that belt to go into the V. So at this point, I'm holding this whole assembly. Get our belt over that. And it definitely could go in a little bit more. So you gotta key that with the splines. Give it a couple little taps. Just like that. And at this point, we'll be able to get the belt even further in, because now I can use some force to push the belt down, and it will just slide into the V of the pulley, just like that. See how it's dropped in a little bit? Kind of helps it along. So at this point, you can see the belt, I have it kind of pulled out a little bit. Go ahead and take that first washer, that's a little bit thicker washer. Take your pulley, and I'm kind of just holding this like such. And it's pretty important that you make sure that's metal touching. You know, the pulley half is touching a washer, not squishing down on the belt. That's an issue that a lot of people have when they put these together for the first time. The nut spins off because you were tightening up against the belt. Then the kind of thin washer, there's a really thick washer with kind of rust on the outside. It's got a slight bevel to it. And then you have this nut right here. You can put Loctite on there if you want. These things are torqued to pretty high value and typically not really an issue. So I got a mechanical torque wrench. I'm going to set this right up to 120, around, you know, between 120 and 130, so about 95 foot-pounds, somewhere in that range. This is the actual factory pin spanner, so it's got pins here. You can find other alternative types of pin spanners. You can make one with a welded piece of metal with 2 bolts. I don't think Bizzetti has one right at this point, but if you want the factory one, we do have available 20442Y. It's pretty expensive. And typically you just put that right into these 2 holes. and it happens to kind of just jam up against the stand right here. Take your 21mm socket. You're gonna want to just torque it like that, but no, don't just use the torque wrench. Pretty critical on this fastener. It's the end of the crankshaft, and I've seen plenty of crankshafts damaged on scooters from transmissions falling apart because things weren't torqued to the correct torque. So kind of holding that, and it's quite a bit. There you go. So that's torque to the factory specification there. And you see the belts like that, that's perfect. And I know there's a little bit of free play here. It's not actually squishing down on the belt. Don't worry about this. The moment you start the scooter, it's gonna tension everything right up. We're gonna take this belt cover, kind of clean the inside of this, because it does have some of that oil residue from that leak and seal. Not really gonna get on anything, but just nice to clean it up. You don't really see this belt cover because it's actually the internal belt cover, but perfect time to clean it up while we're here. And you can see they have dowels. That dowel is rusting a little bit, and that's sometimes why they're a little bit difficult to get off. You can put a small amount of grease on there. And that one was the one that didn't have a bolt. Give it a couple taps. Go ahead and put the screws all the way around. And if you're wondering what the torque is to, it's like something like 10 newton meters or 8 foot-pounds, somewhere in there. Do the trick. I like to get them all in place first, all the way around. And we're gonna go ahead and get one replacement for that. All right, so this thing's got a clutch in it, makes it nice and easy. And typically you wanna go between them like this. And almost forgot, this one's got the little bracket right here. So get that right behind here. And before we tighten that all the way, we'll go ahead and get this one started. Kind of. And that's pretty much all of them right now. And at this point, you want to torque them. You could use something like this and just go around there. Just a little flick of the wrist is all you need to do. All those are nice and tight. And put the 10mm, take our 10mm sockets, actually 8mm bolt. That can torque a little bit more. About 20 newton meters, or about 15, 16 foot-pounds. So about as tight as you want to do some driver like that. So next we got the bolt right here. It does have a washer like that, no Loctite or anything. Thread that in. And you think you may be able to torque that. So we're going to torque it right to 80 newton meters, about 60 foot-pounds, more or less. And here's the problem, is usually we'll want to turn the motor over, and that's why you want to use a tool like this, or very carefully with a pair of screwdrivers in there, maybe have somebody help you. So, you know, hold the 2 screwdrivers, because even this tool wants the turn. So I even see my tech wrote 60 foot-pounds on the tool. There we go. And now you can snap this little cover in. just like that. Kind of a little protection cover, get this out of the way. Time to put the air filter back together. So brand new air filter. Air filter sits in just like this and go in either side. Already wiped the air box out. So you just pretty much just sandwiches in between the inner and outer box here. So go ahead and hold that in place. And we'll get some screws started. Sometimes if it's a little warped, it doesn't want to quite line up in the grooves. You may need to move things around a little bit. They do have these little pegs that kind of line up. We'll get one screw started. And be very careful if you're using a power driver. Make sure you have the clutch set very low. I'll set the clutch very low on this thing. And we'll just start with one because you can see these things. See how this upper part doesn't quite want to line up? Not uncommon. You kind of just got to move it all around, get everything to line up. And that's kind of important so everything seals up on this air box. So get a couple screws in there. And sometimes with these screws, you're better off with a hand drive. A lot of times you want to actually turn backwards, and then when the screw kind of drops in, then you know it's not going to cut new threads into the plastic, because these thread directly into the plastic of the air box. So there we go. And the clutch is set very low on this screwdriver there, so that's all you need. It's just enough to kind of pull the box all together. And we're going to move on to doing the valve adjustment and spark plug. So I'm going to leave the outer belt cover off. We can install that at the very last step. Get this last screw in here for the air box. And that's all tight now. Another thing you want to check, sometimes all the fasteners on this rear little fender, I have seen those come loose. Let's go ahead and drop the gearbox oil. All right, take a 14mm combination wrench. It's your oil drain. It's like right there. You're gonna want to probably drain right onto the tire. Not too worried. I'm gonna put new tires on the scooter too, but go ahead and hold a little tray under there. That kind of helps contain the oil, because you're gonna have about a half liter of oil drain out of this. And the crush washer wanted to come off. That's normal. And we'll have our two crush washers. The fill's right back here. Back of the motor. Both identical bolts for both the fill and the drain. And I kind of have another pan under here. Tends to want to go on the tire. Real wonderful design right there. Get the crush washers off, throw those away. And we have a new crush washer on the bolt right here. Go ahead and wipe that off right around and get that bolt. And there's a couple drips coming out, nothing, you know, not gonna get that much more out. So obviously if the motor's warm, it drains out a little bit easier. Before we go any further, I always want to wipe the tire off. You can use a small amount of brake spray cleaner to get it out of the tread. Pretty important. Don't want to go out riding with oil on your tire. Make sure this is tight. So next you want to have 80/90 oil. We have several different brands available. Oil Gear-A is this Egypt oil. It's an Italian oil manufacturer. We do have a small 60 milliliter syringe available. In order to do it a little quicker, it's going to take 500 cc's, 500 milliliters. A large syringe sometimes is useful, and this goes up to 200 cc's. So I'll do 1 dose at 200 and 2 doses at 150. And just squirt that right into the filler. So 150 milliliters, first syringe full of oil. And this is pretty much the only way you're gonna get this oil in here. It's only a small 10 millimeter opening. All right, so the remaining quantity, add pretty much exactly 500 cc's, 500 milliliters of gear oil in there. And then I have a new crush washer on the fill. You can see it does dribble out a little bit. That's your telltale. So if, for instance, you didn't really measure it, as long as it's dribbling out of that hole, that's the correct quantity. Of course, it's on the wheel again, so I want to wipe that off. And then go ahead and tighten the fill. All right, so that's pretty much half of the 12K service, or more like a third, because did the 6K service, showed you all the checks and the oil change. Look out for that next video. I'm going to show you how to do the valves, check the valve clearance. You're going to need to have a full assortment of shims. These are not exactly do-it-yourself friendly valve adjustments. They don't have threaded adjusters like the GTS and other engines. These have shims in them, which typically hold the valve adjustment much better, so oftentimes you don't need shims. Some workshops you can exchange the shims out, so that may be useful versus buying a very expensive assortment of shims that a workshop would have. And then a spark plug. That's pretty self-explanatory if you got this far. We got the new belt. Obviously going to put the cover back on, but we'll do that after we do the valve adjustment. Thanks for watching. Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. And if you're wondering about the tools, this is a pretty involved video. This is definitely not the most do-it-yourself friendly job. I go over some of the specialty tools I do use throughout the video, but you're going to need a fairly comprehensive mechanics set of tools to do this job.